I never expected my life to take such a turn. If you'd asked me a month ago, I would have told you everything was fine, no, better than fine. It was great. At least, that's what I told myself. My wife, Amy, and I had been married for 12 years. We had what most people would call a good life, a comfortable home in the suburbs, 2 beautiful kids, and a seemingly strong marriage. I thought we were happy. But now, looking back, I wonder if I was just blind, or maybe I just didn't want to see the cracks forming. Amy was always the social one, the life of every party, and she had this ability to charm just about anyone she met. I loved that about her. When we first met, it was one of the things that drew me to her. But recently, something had changed. At first, I thought it was just the stress of life, work, kids, the usual. But it was more than that. About a month ago, I started noticing little things. She became more distant, more critical, and less interested in spending time with me. Our conversations became shorter, filled with awkward silences that were once filled with laughter. And then, there were the nights out. Amy began going out more frequently, claiming she needed time with friends or that she was attending work-related events. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, everyone needs time to themselves, right? But then she started dressing up more than usual. She'd wear dresses that hadn't seen the light of day in years, put on makeup like she was heading to a gala, and spend an unusual amount of time getting ready. I brushed it off at first. I didn't want to seem paranoid or possessive. But the nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach wouldn't go away. It didn't help that our sex life had dwindled to nearly nothing. I would try to initiate, but she'd turn me down with excuses, too tired, too stressed, not in the mood. After a while, I stopped trying altogether. We became more like roommates than a married couple. I tried to talk to her about it once, but it ended with her snapping at me, saying I was overthinking things and that she was just going through a phase. "It's not about you," she'd say, which only made me feel worse. If it wasn't about me, then what was it about? A few days later, I noticed something else, a change in her routine. Amy started going to the gym, something she had never been interested in before. She claimed it was to stay healthy, but I couldn't help but feel there was more to it. The gym bag she left by the door every morning, the way she seemed almost eager to leave the house, it all felt off. And then there were the text messages. I'd catch glimpses of her phone lighting up with messages from someone named Rob. When I asked her about it, she brushed it off, saying he was just a coworker. Still, I wanted to believe her. I didn't want to be that guy, the paranoid husband who imagines things that aren't there. But then came the night that changed everything. Amy told me she was going out with some friends from work. It was a Friday night, and she was all dolled up like she was going on a first date. I remember her kissing me on the cheek before she left, the smell of her perfume lingering in the air long after she was gone. I put the kids to bed and sat on the couch, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling that something was wrong. But I couldn't shake it. Hours passed, and she still wasn't home. I texted her, asking if everything was okay, but got no response. Midnight came and went. I tried calling her, but it went straight to voicemail. By this point, I was pacing the living room, my mind racing with all the worst-case scenarios. Was she hurt? Was she okay? Or was she with someone else? When she finally came home, it was nearly 2 a.m. She walked in, reeking of alcohol, her hair disheveled. I asked her where she'd been, and she just laughed it off, saying she lost track of time. "Don't wait up for me next time," she said, as if that was supposed to make everything okay. She stumbled up the stairs and went straight to bed, leaving me standing there in the dark, feeling more alone than I ever had in my life. That night, I barely slept. My mind was consumed with questions I wasn't sure I wanted the answers to. The next morning, I tried to talk to her again, but she was in one of her moods, snapping at me for even suggesting there was something wrong. "You're overreacting," she said. "I told you I was out with friends. Why can't you just trust me?" Trust. That word hung in the air like a bad smell. Trust was the foundation of our marriage, or at least it was supposed to be. But now, I wasn't so sure. I wanted to believe her, I really did. But the signs were all there, and they were getting harder to ignore. The following week, things got even worse. She started getting phone calls late at night, which she'd take in another room, speaking in hushed tones. When I'd ask who it was, she'd just say it was work-related and change the subject. She became even more distant, barely speaking to me unless it was to criticize something I'd done wrong. Our house, once filled with warmth and laughter, was now cold and tense. I could feel the walls closing in on me, and I didn't know how much longer I could take it. Then, one day, I found something that made my heart stop. Amy had left her phone on the kitchen counter while she was in the shower. Normally, I wouldn't snoop through her things, but something compelled me to look. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't help myself. I needed to know the truth. I opened her messages and saw a conversation with Rob, the coworker she'd mentioned. But it wasn't just work-related. The messages were flirty, intimate, and far too personal for just friends. My hands shook as I scrolled through, each message a punch to the gut. There were photos too, selfies she'd taken, looking sexy and seductive, the kind she used to send to me when we first started dating. But these weren't for me. They were for him. I felt sick to my stomach. My mind was spinning, my heart pounding in my chest. I put the phone down as if it had burned me and walked out of the kitchen, trying to catch my breath. I wanted to confront her, to demand an explanation, but I knew I couldn't do it right then. I needed time to process what I'd just seen. For the rest of the day, I avoided her. I couldn't even look at her without feeling the bile rise in my throat. How could she do this to me? To us? I thought we had a good life. I thought she loved me. But now, everything I thought I knew was crumbling around me. That night, as I lay in bed next to her, I realized I couldn't go on like this. I needed answers. I needed to know the truth, no matter how much it hurt. Because if there was one thing I couldn't live with, it was being lied to by the woman I loved. Tomorrow, I'd confront her. I didn't know how it would go, but I knew I had to do it. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay when it clearly wasn't. Our marriage was on the line, and it was time to find out if there was anything left to save. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of dread that weighed heavy on my chest. Amy was already up, moving around the house as if nothing had changed. I watched her from the corner of my eye, the anger and hurt festering inside me like a wound that refused to heal. I didn't say anything, not yet. I needed to bide my time, to find the right moment to confront her. But that moment would come soon, sooner than I had planned. She told me she had another work thing that evening, something she had to attend, and that she'd be out late. I didn't question her, just nodded and pretended to be indifferent. But inside, my mind was racing. I needed to know for sure if she was lying to me, and there was only one way to find out. I decided to follow her. When she left the house that evening, dressed to the nines in one of her sexiest outfits, I waited a few minutes before grabbing my keys and heading out the door. I kept my distance, trailing behind her car as she drove across town. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Every part of me hoped I was wrong, that she was really going to some work event and that this was all just some terrible misunderstanding. But deep down, I knew better. She pulled into the parking lot of a small hostel on the outskirts of town, a place that looked far too seedy for any work-related event. My heart sank as I watched her park and get out of the car. She looked around as if checking to make sure no one had followed her, and then she headed inside. I parked a safe distance away and waited. Minutes passed, and then I saw him, Rob. He stepped out of the hostel and stood by the entrance, looking around with a smug grin on his face, like he owned the place. My blood boiled at the sight of him, this asshole who had been sending my wife flirty messages, who had stolen her attention and affection from me. And then, she came out. Amy walked up to him, and without a word, they embraced. My stomach churned as I watched them, my worst fears coming true right before my eyes. They stood there for a moment, just holding each other, and then he leaned in and kissed her, deep, passionate, like they were the only two people in the world. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened, my vision blurred with the rage and betrayal that consumed me. There they were, kissing like nothing else mattered, like I didn't exist. I felt the walls closing in on me, the reality of the situation crashing down like a tidal wave. This wasn't just an affair. This was a betrayal of the worst kind. I don't remember getting out of the car. I don't remember walking toward them. All I remember is the fire in my veins, the sound of my blood pounding in my ears, and the uncontrollable need to make them both feel the pain they were inflicting on me. They didn't see me coming. Amy had her back turned, too lost in her lover's embrace to notice the fury approaching her. But Rob saw me first. His eyes widened in shock, but before he could react, my fist connected with his jaw. The impact reverberated through my arm, but I didn't care. I wanted to hurt him, to make him pay for what he'd done. He staggered back, clutching his face, but I wasn't done. I grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against the wall of the hostel. "You piece of shit!" I spat, my voice shaking with rage. "You think you can just steal my wife? You think you can get away with this?" Amy screamed, her voice shrill and panicked, but I barely heard her. All I could see was Rob, this smug bastard who had dared to touch what was mine. I threw another punch, landing squarely on his nose. Blood splattered, and he cried out in pain, but I didn't care. I wanted to break him, to see him suffer the way I was suffering. Amy tried to pull me off him, screaming at me to stop, but her voice was just noise in the background. I pushed her away, hard enough to make her stumble back. "How could you?" I shouted at her, my voice cracking with the weight of my anguish. "How could you do this to me? To our family?" She didn't answer. She just stood there, tears streaming down her face, looking more like a scared little girl than the confident woman I thought I knew. But I couldn't find it in me to feel sorry for her. Not after what I had just seen. Rob finally managed to push me off him, staggering away, his face a mess of blood and bruises. "You're crazy, man," he shouted, but there was fear in his eyes, fear that gave me a sick sense of satisfaction. "Get away from me. Get the fuck out of here," I yelled, my voice hoarse from the effort. "If I ever see you near her again, I swear to God, I'll kill you." He didn't need to be told twice. He turned and bolted, running down the street like the coward he was, leaving Amy and me alone in the dimly lit parking lot. I watched him go, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the adrenaline still pumping through my system. Then, I turned to Amy. She was trembling, her makeup smudged from crying, her expression one of pure terror. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. All the words I wanted to scream at her got stuck in my throat, tangled up in the hurt and anger that threatened to consume me. "How long?" I finally managed to choke out. "How long has this been going on?" She didn't answer right away. She just stared at me, like she couldn't believe this was happening. "It's not what you think," she started, but I cut her off. "Don't lie to me," I shouted, my voice echoing off the walls of the hostel. "I saw you. I saw you with him. How long?" She flinched at the volume of my voice, but finally, she spoke. "A few months," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's only been a few months." "A few months?" I repeated, my mind reeling. A few months of lying to my face, of sneaking around behind my back? She didn't deny it. She just stood there, her head hanging low, as if she was too ashamed to look at me. "I'm sorry," she said, but the words felt hollow, meaningless. "Sorry?" I repeated, my voice dripping with disbelief. "You're sorry? Do you have any idea what you've done? You've destroyed everything, Amy. Everything." She broke down then, sobbing uncontrollably, but I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. "Not now. Not after everything." I just stood there, feeling the last shreds of my life unravel around me, wondering how it had come to this. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and walked away, leaving her there in the parking lot, her cries echoing in the night. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I needed to get away, to clear my head, to figure out what the hell I was going to do next. As I drove away, the image of them kissing, of Amy's betrayal, played over and over in my mind. I felt like I was drowning, suffocating under the weight of it all. How could she do this to me? To us? I knew one thing for sure, I couldn't go back to the way things were. Something had to change, and I wasn't sure our marriage could survive it. I drove around aimlessly that night, trying to make sense of the chaos that had just torn through my life. The streets were quiet, almost eerily so, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do next. My thoughts were a tangled mess: rage, betrayal, confusion. I felt like I was on the edge of a cliff, one wrong step away from losing it completely. Eventually, I found myself parked in a deserted lot, my hands still shaking on the steering wheel. The reality of what had just happened started to sink in, and with it came the crushing weight of what I had to do next. I couldn't avoid it any longer. I had to go back home. I had to confront Amy, really confront her, and figure out what the hell was going on in her mind. But how do you even begin to talk to someone after catching them in such a blatant act of betrayal? The idea of facing her again made my stomach turn, but I knew I couldn't run from this forever. The drive home was a blur. By the time I pulled into our driveway, it was well past midnight. The house was dark, and for a moment, I considered sleeping in the car just to avoid going inside. But that wasn't an option, not really. I needed answers, and hiding out in my car wasn't going to give them to me. I walked into the house, the door creaking loudly in the stillness of the night. The place was quiet, too quiet. I half expected to find Amy sitting in the living room, waiting for me, but the house felt empty, like all the life had been sucked out of it. I found her in our bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed, her head in her hands. She didn't look up when I entered. She just sat there, her shoulders shaking as she cried silently. For a moment, I just stood there, watching her, my emotions swirling. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to tell her it would be okay, but another part of me, the part that was still reeling from the image of her in another man's arms, wanted to scream at her, to demand why she had done this to me. Why? The word came out more as a whisper than a shout, but it cut through the silence like a knife. She looked up then, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "I never meant for you to find out like this." "Like this?" I repeated, incredulous. "How exactly did you think I would find out, Amy? Or were you planning on just keeping this little affair going behind my back forever?" She flinched at my words, but she didn't look away. "I don't know," she admitted. "I didn't think it would go this far." "You didn't think it would go this far?" I echoed, my voice rising with each word. "What the hell does that even mean? You've been sneaking around with this guy for months, Amy. Kissing him, God knows what else. And you didn't think it would go this far?" She looked away, unable to meet my eyes, and that only fueled my anger. "How could you do this to me?" I demanded, my voice cracking under the weight of my emotions. "How could you destroy everything we built together? Everything we had?" "I didn't mean to," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was lonely, and he was there." "Lonely?" I spat, disbelief washing over me. "You were lonely, so you decided to fuck around with some random guy? That's your excuse?" "He wasn't random," she said quietly, and that only made it worse. "We worked together, and it just happened." Just happened? I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. Affairs don't just happen, Amy. You made a choice, a deliberate, conscious choice to cheat on me. You could have talked to me, told me you were lonely, that you needed something more, but instead, you went behind my back. "I didn't want to hurt you," she said, and I could hear the desperation in her voice, but it only made me angrier. "Well, congratulations," I snapped. "You managed to do exactly that." She started crying again, but I couldn't bring myself to care. I had spent the last few hours in a whirlwind of emotions, trying to make sense of the betrayal, but now, all I felt was a cold, empty void where my love for her used to be. I wanted to know why she did it, what had driven her to this, but I wasn't sure I could handle the answers. Was it worth it? I asked, my voice shaking. Was he worth throwing away everything we had? She shook her head, her tears falling freely now. No, she whispered. No, he wasn't. Then why? I demanded, stepping closer to her. Why, Amy? Why did you do it? She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a pain that mirrored my own. I don't know, she said, her voice cracking. I was confused, I felt trapped, and he made me feel alive again. Alive? I repeated, the word tasting bitter on my tongue. You needed some other guy to make you feel alive? What about me? What about our marriage? Did that mean nothing to you? It did, she insisted, but it sounded weak, like even she didn't believe it. It does. I love you, but... But what? I demanded, my patience wearing thin. But it felt like we were drifting apart, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Like we were just going through the motions. I didn't know how to fix it, and then Rob, he was just there, and I made a mistake. A mistake? I said bitterly. A mistake is forgetting our anniversary or leaving the toilet seat up. What you did was a betrayal, Amy. You lied to me, to our kids. How the hell am I supposed to get past that? She didn't have an answer. She just sat there, looking broken and defeated, and for the first time, I realized how far gone we really were. The woman sitting in front of me wasn't the same person I had fallen in love with all those years ago. She was a stranger, someone who had let our marriage fall apart while I was too busy convincing myself that everything was fine. For a long time, we just sat there in silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on us like a suffocating blanket. I wanted to scream, to lash out, to make her feel the same pain I was feeling, but I knew it wouldn't change anything. The damage was done, and there was no going back. I don't know if I can forgive you, I finally said, my voice barely audible. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with fear. Please, she whispered, reaching out to take my hand. Please, let's try to work this out. I'll do anything. I'll go to counseling, I'll quit my job, whatever it takes. Just, please don't leave me. I pulled my hand away, the touch of her skin sending a jolt of anger through me. I don't know if there's anything left to work out, I said coldly. You've broken my trust, Amy. How am I supposed to ever believe anything you say again? She didn't have an answer. She just stared at me, her eyes pleading, but I couldn't bring myself to care. I was too numb, too hurt, too angry to feel anything other than the crushing weight of her betrayal. I think you should go, I said finally, my voice flat and emotionless. She looked at me in shock. What? Where? I don't care, I said, turning away from her. Go to your parents, go to a friend's, I don't care. But I can't be around you right now. Please, don't do this, she begged, her voice shaking with desperation. We can work through this, I know we can. Just go, Amy, I said, my voice hardening. I need space. I need time to think. She started crying again, but I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I heard her get up, heard her grab her things, but I didn't look at her. I just stood there, staring out the window, feeling like my entire world was crumbling around me. The sound of the door closing behind her was like a final nail in the coffin, sealing the end of everything we had built together. I didn't know what I was going to do next. I didn't know if there was any way to salvage our marriage or if I even wanted to. All I knew was that the life I thought I had was gone, shattered into a million pieces by the woman I thought I could trust above all else. I stood there for what felt like hours, lost in my thoughts, before finally collapsing onto the bed. The exhaustion, both physical and emotional, was overwhelming. I felt like I was drowning, unable to catch my breath, unable to find any solid ground to stand on. How had things gotten this bad? How had I let it get this far? But deep down, I knew the answer. I had been blind, willingly blind, to the signs that something was wrong. I had convinced myself that everything was fine, that our marriage was strong, even as it was slowly falling apart. And now, I was paying the price for that blindness. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know if I could ever forgive Amy, if I could ever move past this betrayal. But I did know one thing: I couldn't keep living in denial. It was time to face the truth, no matter how painful it was. And the truth was, my marriage was over. Whether it was officially over yet or not, something had broken between us that might never be fixed. The house was eerily quiet after Amy left. The silence was heavy, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were bearing down on me. I sat on the bed, staring blankly at the floor, trying to process everything that had just happened. The anger that had surged through me during our confrontation had simmered down, replaced by a cold, steely resolve. Amy had betrayed me in the worst way possible, and I wasn't just going to let her walk away without facing the consequences. I thought about the years we'd spent together, the good times, the bad, all the sacrifices I'd made for her and our family. I thought about how I'd trusted her, loved her, and how she'd thrown it all away for some meaningless fling. She had taken everything we had built and stomped on it like it was nothing. And now, she was out there, probably thinking she could beg for forgiveness and everything would eventually go back to normal. But she was wrong, dead wrong. Revenge was a concept I'd never seriously considered before. It always seemed like something out of a bad movie or a cheap novel, something petty and beneath me. But now, it didn't seem so far-fetched. In fact, it seemed like the only way to make her understand the magnitude of what she'd done. She needed to feel the same pain, the same humiliation that she had inflicted on me. I wanted her to know that she couldn't just betray me and walk away unscathed. As I sat there, my mind started to turn over the possibilities, ideas forming and taking shape. I wasn't going to do anything physical, no, that would be too easy for her to dismiss. My revenge needed to be psychological, emotional. It needed to hit her where it would hurt the most. And what better place to start than with the things she cared about the most? Amy had always been obsessed with her image, how people saw her, what they thought of her. She was the kind of person who thrived on the approval of others, who needed to be admired and respected. The thought of people looking down on her, of seeing her as anything less than perfect, would eat away at her. That was my way in. First, I needed to gather information, leverage that I could use against her. Amy had always been careful, but she had gotten sloppy lately, too comfortable in her deception. I knew there were things she kept hidden, things she wouldn't want the world to see. And I was determined to find them. I started by going through her phone, which she had left behind in her rush to leave the house. I spent hours combing through her messages, her emails, her photos, looking for anything that I could use. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. There were more messages between her and Rob, more than I had seen before. Some were explicit, others were just painfully intimate, but all of them painted a clear picture of her betrayal. But that wasn't all I found. Amy had been corresponding with other men too, nothing as serious as with Rob, but flirtatious nonetheless. It seemed she had been casting a wide net, enjoying the attention from multiple directions. The realization made my blood boil, but it also gave me what I needed. I started saving everything, screenshots of messages, photos, anything that could be used to expose her. But I didn't stop there. I knew Amy was active on social media, always curating the perfect image of her life for the world to see. So, I started digging into her accounts, looking for inconsistencies, lies, anything that I could use to tear down the facade she had built. I found a lot more than I expected, little things she had lied about to make herself look better, interactions that could easily be twisted to paint her in a negative light. By the time I was done, I had compiled a dossier on Amy that would make her skin crawl if she ever saw it. But I wasn't going to confront her with it, at least not directly. No, I had something else in mind. I decided to take a more subtle approach, something that would unravel her life piece by piece, making her feel like everything she had worked for was slipping through her fingers. I started with her friends, the people she valued most after our family. Amy's social circle was tight-knit, but I knew enough about them to know where the cracks were. A few well-placed messages from an anonymous account, some carefully worded hints about what Amy had been up to, and I knew the seeds of doubt would start to grow. It wasn't long before I began to see the effects. Amy had always been the queen bee among her friends, the one they all looked up to, but now there was a shift. Her friends started pulling away, subtly at first, but it was there. They stopped inviting her to things, stopped responding to her messages as quickly, and I knew it was only a matter of time before they started questioning her outright. But that was just the beginning. Next, I turned my attention to her work. Amy had always been proud of her job, always talking about how much her colleagues respected her. So, I found a way to leak some of the more damaging information to a few choice people at her workplace, nothing too overt, just enough to make them start questioning her character. I didn't want her to lose her job, that would have been too much, too fast. No, I wanted her to feel the pressure, to sense that her carefully constructed world was crumbling around her, piece by piece. The final step in my plan was the most personal. I started leaving subtle reminders around the house, things that would make her think of Rob, of her betrayal, every time she saw them. I changed the wallpaper on her laptop to a photo of the place where I had caught them kissing, so every time she opened it, she'd be reminded of that moment. I placed items around the house that were linked to our past, things that would make her remember how good we once had it before she decided to throw it all away. When Amy finally came home after a few days at her parents' house, the tension between us was palpable. She walked in with a tentative smile, like she was testing the waters, trying to gauge my mood. But I didn't give her anything to work with. I just watched her, waiting to see how long it would take before she started to notice the changes. It didn't take long. The first sign that my plan was working came a few days later. I overheard her on the phone with one of her friends, her voice strained as she tried to figure out why they hadn't invited her to an event. I could hear the frustration in her voice, the confusion as she struggled to understand why she was suddenly being excluded. But of course, her friend didn't give her a straight answer. They just mumbled something about it being a small gathering, nothing personal, which only made Amy more paranoid. She started spending more time at home, trying to talk to me, trying to act like everything was normal, but I kept my distance. I wasn't rude or hostile, but I didn't give her the comfort or the reassurance she was clearly seeking. I let her stew in her own thoughts, let her mind run wild with the possibilities of what was going wrong. Then, she started noticing the little things around the house, the reminders of her betrayal. I saw her flinch when she opened her laptop and saw the wallpaper, her expression shifting from confusion to dread. She didn't say anything, but I could see the guilt in her eyes every time she walked past the places where I had strategically placed those reminders. The tension in the house grew thicker with each passing day. Amy was on edge, trying to figure out what was happening, why her life seemed to be spiraling out of control. She became more desperate, more frantic, trying to fix things with me, with her friends, at work. But no matter what she did, things kept slipping further away from her grasp. One night, she finally broke down. We were sitting in the living room, the air between us heavy with unspoken words, when she suddenly burst into tears. "I don't know what's happening," she sobbed, her voice cracking with desperation. "It feels like everything is falling apart. My friends, my job, us. Please, tell me what to do. I'll do anything to fix this." I looked at her, the woman who had once been my everything, now reduced to a trembling mess, and I felt a cold satisfaction. This was what she deserved, this fear, this uncertainty, this pain. She had brought it all on herself. But even as I felt that satisfaction, there was a part of me that ached, that mourned for what we had lost. For what she had destroyed. "I don't know if you can fix this, Amy," I said, my voice calm, almost detached. "You made your choices, and now you have to live with the consequences." She looked at me, her eyes wide with fear and regret. "Please," she whispered, reaching out to take my hand. "Please don't leave me. I know I messed up, but I love you. I need you." I pulled my hand away, the touch of her skin still too raw, too painful. You should have thought about that before you decided to throw everything away, I said coldly. You should have thought about what it would do to me, to us, before you ran off with him. Her sobs grew louder, but I didn't comfort her. I just stood up and walked out of the room, leaving her to cry alone in the darkness. I didn't know what the future held for us, but I knew one thing for sure: Amy would never forget what she had done. She would never forget the pain she had caused, or the revenge I had taken. And that, in some small way, gave me the closure I needed. The days that followed were a blur of emotions, anger, sadness, and a hollow sense of victory. Watching Amy unravel under the weight of her own guilt had given me some satisfaction, but it wasn't enough. There was still one loose end that needed to be tied up: Rob, the man who had played a part in shattering my life. He had walked away from our encounter outside the hostel with nothing more than a bruised face, but that was far from the punishment he deserved. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. How dare he come into my life, take what wasn't his, and then just disappear without facing any real consequences? The more I stewed on it, the clearer it became that he needed to pay. He needed to understand that his actions had consequences, that he couldn't just mess with someone's life and walk away unscathed. My first step was to find out everything I could about Rob. I knew a little already: his full name, where he worked, but that wasn't enough. I needed more, and I knew exactly where to start. I had all the information I needed right at my fingertips, thanks to Amy's phone. It was still filled with messages and photos, evidence of their affair, and it also held the key to learning more about him. I started by digging through his social media profiles. Rob had been careless, leaving much of his information public, which made my task easier. I found out where he lived, the places he frequented, his hobbies, and even the names of some of his closest friends and family. The more I learned, the more I began to formulate a plan, something that would make him regret ever getting involved with my wife. Revenge on Rob needed to be different from what I had done to Amy. With her, it had been about undermining her social standing, her sense of self-worth. But with him, it needed to be more direct, more personal. I wanted to hit him where it hurt the most, to make him feel the same sense of betrayal and violation that he had caused me. Rob was a well-respected figure in his community. He had a good job, a solid reputation, and a seemingly perfect life. He was the kind of guy who was always the center of attention, always the one people turned to for advice or a good time. But that also meant he had a lot to lose, and that was exactly what I planned to exploit. I started by crafting a series of anonymous emails, carefully worded to suggest that Rob had been involved in some less than savory activities. I knew he was involved in local charities and community events, so I made sure to drop hints about potential misconduct, enough to raise eyebrows without being too overt. The beauty of it was that the emails were vague enough to make people suspicious but not specific enough for Rob to easily refute. I sent them to key figures in his social circle, his boss, his colleagues, the heads of the charities he supported. Then I waited. It didn't take long for the fallout to begin. Within a week, I started hearing rumors, whispers that Rob was under investigation at work, that people were starting to question his integrity. He hadn't been fired yet, but I knew it was only a matter of time before the pressure got to him. His reputation, the thing he had worked so hard to build, was beginning to crumble, and I relished every moment of it. But that was just the start. The real blow came when I decided to take things a step further. Rob had a girlfriend, a woman he had been seeing for a few years. I found out about her through his social media, where they had posted countless photos of their happy moments together. It made me sick to my stomach to see how easily he had juggled his relationship with her and his affair with Amy. He had lied to both of us, and it was time for him to face the consequences. I created a fake social media profile, something that would appear harmless enough, and used it to send a message to Rob's girlfriend. I included screenshots of the messages between him and Amy, photos they had exchanged, and a detailed account of their affair. I made sure to frame it as if I was a concerned third party, someone who had stumbled upon the information and felt it was only right to share it with her. I knew it would devastate her, but I didn't care. She deserved to know the truth, just like I had. A few days later, I saw the fallout of my actions. Rob's social media went dark, no posts, no updates. The photos of him and his girlfriend disappeared, and soon after, I heard through the grapevine that they had broken up. The pieces were all falling into place, just as I had planned. But there was still one more thing I wanted to do, something that would leave a lasting mark on Rob's life. I knew he prided himself on his work, on his ability to command respect and admiration from those around him. So, I decided to hit him where it would hurt the most, his career. Using the information I had gathered, I compiled a dossier of all the questionable things Rob had done, both personally and professionally. I included everything from his affair with Amy to the rumors I had started about his misconduct at work. Then I sent it anonymously to his company's HR department, making sure it would land on the desk of someone who would take it seriously. The result was swift and brutal. Rob was suspended from his job pending an investigation, and though I wasn't privy to the details, I knew it wouldn't end well for him. His career, the thing he had built his life around, was crumbling beneath him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. I imagined him sitting in his now empty apartment, his life in shambles, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. And in that moment, I felt a cold satisfaction wash over me. He had gotten what he deserved. He had taken what was mine, and now he was paying the price. But as much as I wanted to feel triumphant, there was an emptiness inside me that I couldn't shake. Revenge had given me a sense of closure, yes, but it hadn't healed the wound that Amy and Rob had inflicted. It hadn't brought back the life I had lost, the trust that had been shattered. It hadn't filled the void that now existed where my marriage used to be. I sat in the quiet of my home, the weight of everything pressing down on me, and realized that while I had succeeded in making Rob pay, it hadn't brought me the peace I thought it would. The satisfaction was fleeting, leaving behind only a hollow echo of what once was. I had avenged my honor, but at what cost? My life was still in pieces, and the future was uncertain. Amy was still out there, trying to pick up the pieces of her own shattered life, and I was left to deal with the aftermath of my choices. The revenge had been sweet, but the bitterness that followed was overwhelming. In the end, I had won the battle, but the war for my happiness, my peace of mind, that was still far from over. The days following my revenge on Rob were marked by a strange sense of emptiness. I had set out to destroy the man who had wronged me, and I had succeeded. His life was in ruins, and Amy was living in the aftermath of her own choices. Yet, despite everything, there was no sense of closure, no feeling of triumph. Instead, I found myself lost in the silence of our once bustling home, the weight of my actions and the devastation of my marriage hanging over me like a dark cloud. Amy had moved back into the house a few days after I confronted her, though things between us were far from resolved. We existed in a state of uneasy truce, avoiding each other as much as possible. The tension was palpable, but neither of us had the energy to confront it. We were like two ghosts haunting the same space, neither willing to acknowledge the other, both trapped in our own misery. I knew that we couldn't go on like this forever. Something had to give, and soon. We needed to have one final conversation, to lay everything out on the table and decide what our next steps would be. Whether we would try to salvage what was left of our marriage or go our separate ways, we couldn't keep living in this limbo. It was a cold, rainy evening when I finally decided to confront Amy. The kids were spending the weekend with my parents, giving us the perfect opportunity to talk without distractions. I found her in the living room, sitting on the couch with a blanket wrapped around her, staring blankly at the television. The sight of her, so small and broken, stirred something in me, but I quickly pushed it aside. There was no room for sympathy, not now, not after everything. "Amy," I said, my voice breaking the heavy silence that had settled over the room. She looked up at me, her eyes tired and puffy from days of crying. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to talk," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We can't keep going on like this." She nodded slowly, as if she had been expecting this moment but had dreaded its arrival all the same. She shifted on the couch, making room for me to sit beside her, but I remained standing, too restless to settle down. "I've been thinking a lot," I began, my hands clenching and unclenching at my sides. About everything that's happened, about us, about what comes next. She didn't say anything, just watched me with those sad, guilty eyes that had become all too familiar over the past few weeks. I don't know if we can fix this, I continued, the words heavy on my tongue. I don't know if I even want to. A flash of pain crossed her face, but she quickly looked away, her gaze falling to the floor. I understand, she said quietly. I'm not saying this to hurt you, I said, though I wasn't sure if that was entirely true. I can't pretend like everything's okay. I can't just move on like nothing happened. I know, she replied, her voice trembling. I don't expect you to. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. But I also don't know if I can just throw everything away. We've been together for so long, Amy. We have a family, a life. It's not something I can just walk away from. She looked up at me then, her eyes wide and desperate. I don't want to lose you, she whispered. I know I messed up, God, I know I did. But I love you, and I want to make this right. I'll do whatever it takes, please, just give me a chance. Her words were filled with a sincerity that I hadn't heard from her in a long time, and for a moment, I wavered. This was the woman I had loved, the woman I had built my life with. The thought of losing her, of losing everything we had worked for, was almost too much to bear. But then I remembered the betrayal, the lies, the image of her kissing Rob outside that damn hostel. The anger that had been simmering inside me flared up again, burning away any lingering thoughts of forgiveness. I don't know if I can, I said, my voice cold. I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again. She flinched as if I had slapped her, tears welling up in her eyes. Please, don't say that, she begged. I know I hurt you, but I love you. I want to be with you. I want to fix this. Love? I scoffed, unable to hide the bitterness in my voice. You call this love? You betrayed me, Amy. You destroyed everything we had. How am I supposed to believe anything you say after that? She started crying in earnest then, her shoulders shaking with sobs. I'm sorry, she choked out between sobs. I'm so sorry. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm begging you, please don't give up on us. I stood there, watching her cry, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to tell her that we would get through this, that we could rebuild what had been broken. But another part of me, a darker part, wanted her to suffer, to feel the same pain that I had felt. I was torn between the man I used to be and the man I had become in the wake of her betrayal. Finally, I sat down beside her, though I kept a careful distance. What do you want from me, Amy? I asked, my voice tired. What do you really want? She wiped her tears away, sniffling as she tried to compose herself. I want us to try again, she said, her voice trembling. I know it won't be easy, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this work. I'll go to counseling, I'll quit my job, whatever you want. Just, please don't leave me. Her desperation was palpable, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of something other than anger. It was pity, yes, but also something deeper, an understanding that despite everything, she was still the woman I had chosen to spend my life with, the mother of my children. She had hurt me in ways I never thought possible, but the thought of walking away, of tearing our family apart, filled me with a sense of dread. I'm not leaving, I said finally, the word surprising even me. But things can't go back to the way they were. If we're going to do this, it's going to take a lot of work. And I'm not going to pretend that I'll be able to forgive you overnight, if ever. She nodded, her eyes filled with a cautious hope. I understand, she said softly. I'm willing to do whatever it takes, as long as we're together. I sighed, running a hand through my hair as I tried to process everything. We'll start with counseling, I said. We need help, professional help, if we're going to have any chance of making this work. I'll set it up, she said quickly, relief evident in her voice. I'll find a counselor first thing tomorrow. Good, I replied, though I wasn't sure if I was saying it for her benefit or my own. But Amy, this doesn't mean everything's okay. I still don't know how I feel about all of this. I don't want to make any rash decisions. I understand, she repeated, her voice small. I'm just grateful that you're willing to try. I nodded, though my mind was far from settled. There was so much to process, so much to work through, and I wasn't sure if I had the strength to do it. But the thought of giving up, of walking away from everything, seemed too final, too heartbreaking. I wasn't ready to close that door, not yet. As we sat there in silence, the rain continuing to patter against the windows, I couldn't help but wonder if we were making the right choice. Could we really rebuild what had been broken, or were we just delaying the inevitable? Only time would tell, but for now, I knew that we needed to try. For the sake of our children, for the sake of the life we had built, we needed to give it one last shot. Let's take it one day at a time, I said finally, breaking the silence. We'll go to counseling, we'll talk, and we'll see where it takes us. Thank you, she whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. Thank you for giving us a chance. I didn't respond, just sat there staring at the wall, my mind a tangled mess of emotions. I wasn't sure what the future held, or if we even had a future. But for now, we were still here, still together, and that was something. Whether it would be enough, only time would tell. As the night wore on and the rain continued to fall, I felt a sense of exhaustion settle over me. The weight of the past few weeks, the stress, the anger, the betrayal, it all came crashing down at once, leaving me drained and hollow. I knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for it. But I also knew that I couldn't walk away without trying, without giving us one last chance to make things right. Let's go to bed, I said finally, my voice heavy with fatigue. We'll talk more in the morning. Amy nodded, standing up slowly as if she was afraid of breaking the fragile peace between us. Okay, she whispered, her voice barely audible. We made our way upstairs in silence, the tension between us still thick, but there was a sense of resolution now, a tentative agreement to move forward, however uncertain the path might be. As we lay down in bed, the space between us feeling like a chasm, I couldn't help but wonder if we were doing the right thing. Was it better to try and fix what was broken, or would we just end up hurting each other even more in the process? But for now, I pushed those thoughts aside. I was too tired to think, too exhausted to care. All I wanted was to close my eyes and forget, if only for a little while. As I drifted off to sleep, Amy reached out and took my hand, her touch tentative and unsure. I didn't pull away, but I didn't squeeze back either. We were both holding on, but just barely. And as the darkness closed in around us, I couldn't shake the feeling that our story was far from over, but where it would lead, I had no idea. The following weeks were a blur of counseling sessions, long, tense conversations, and awkward attempts at normalcy. Amy and I both knew that the road ahead would be anything but easy, but we were trying to piece together the shattered remains of our marriage, trying to find a way forward. Yet, even as we went through the motions of rebuilding, there was an unspoken understanding between us that things would never be the same. Our counselor, Dr. Lewis, was a calm and patient man in his mid-50s. He had a gentle way of guiding our conversations, steering us away from the anger and resentment that had built up over the years, and helping us focus on what was truly important. But even with his help, progress was slow. Each session felt like we were peeling back layers of hurt, revealing wounds that neither of us had fully acknowledged before. At first, the sessions were mostly about me venting my anger and betrayal, while Amy sat quietly, absorbing the weight of my words. I couldn't help but feel that these sessions were more for my benefit than hers, an outlet for the rage that still simmered beneath the surface. But as time went on, Dr. Lewis encouraged us to dig deeper, to explore the underlying issues that had led to the breakdown of our marriage. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was about years of neglect, unspoken frustrations, and the slow erosion of trust that had started long before Rob ever entered the picture. We talked about how we had drifted apart, how we had allowed the demands of work, parenting, and life in general to pull us in different directions. We talked about how we had stopped communicating, how we had taken each other for granted, and how we had let the love we once shared wither away. There were moments of clarity, brief glimpses of understanding that made me believe we could find our way back to each other. But there were also moments of despair, when the enormity of what had happened seemed too much to overcome. Amy was trying, she really was, but there were times when I couldn't help but wonder if it was too late. If the damage had been done and we were just delaying the inevitable. One evening, after a particularly grueling session with Dr. Lewis, we found ourselves sitting in the kitchen, the tension between us thick enough to cut with a knife. The kids were in bed, and the house was quiet, but the silence between us was deafening. We had talked about the affair again, about how it had started, how it had made Amy feel alive in a way that our marriage no longer did. I had tried to listen without judgment, but it was hard, so damn hard, to hear her say those things, to see the pain in her eyes as she admitted her mistakes. I feel like I don't even know who we are anymore, I said finally, breaking the silence. I was staring at my hands, unable to meet her gaze. It's like we're just going through the motions, trying to fix something that might be beyond repair. Amy didn't respond right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost hesitant. Do you think, maybe we've been holding on to something that's already gone? Her words hung in the air, heavy with the truth we had both been avoiding. It was a question I had asked myself many times over the past few weeks, but hearing her say it out loud made it real, made it something we couldn't ignore. I don't know, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I want to believe we can fix this, but I don't know if I have it in me to keep trying. She looked at me then, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and acceptance. Maybe that's our answer, she said quietly. Maybe we've been trying so hard to save something that's already gone, because we're afraid of what comes next. I felt a lump form in my throat, and I swallowed hard, trying to keep my emotions in check. I don't want to give up on us, I said, my voice cracking. But maybe it's time to let go. The words felt like a death sentence, like the final nail in the coffin of our marriage. But as soon as I said them, I knew they were true. We had been holding on to a past that no longer existed, clinging to the hope that we could somehow turn back the clock and undo the damage that had been done. But life didn't work that way, and no amount of counseling or talking could change the fact that we had lost something fundamental, something that couldn't be regained. Amy nodded slowly, tears welling up in her eyes. I think you're right, she whispered, her voice trembling. I love you, but I don't think we can go back to the way things were. And maybe we're not supposed to. The silence that followed was filled with the weight of our shared realization. We had tried, God, we had tried, but in the end, it wasn't enough. The trust, the love, the bond we had once shared was broken, and no amount of effort could put it back together. We were two people who had grown apart, who had hurt each other in ways that couldn't be undone, and now we had to face the reality of what that meant. What do we do now? I asked, my voice shaky. I think, Amy paused, taking a deep breath as she wiped away her tears. I think we need to let each other go. For our own sake, and for the kids. We need to find a way to move forward, separately. The thought of separating, of ending our marriage, was terrifying. It was the last thing I had ever wanted, but now, faced with the cold reality of our situation, I knew she was right. Holding on to something that was already broken would only cause more pain, for both of us, and for our children. I don't know how to do that, I admitted, feeling a surge of panic rising in my chest. I don't know how to let go. We'll figure it out, she said softly. We'll take it one step at a time, for the kids, and for ourselves. And maybe we'll both find a way to be happy again. There was no anger in her voice, no resentment, just a quiet acceptance of what needed to be done. And in that moment, I realized that this was the most loving thing we could do for each other. We had fought for our marriage, but now it was time to fight for our own happiness, even if that meant letting go of each other. We'll talk to the kids, I said, my voice thick with emotion. We'll tell them together, and we'll make sure they know this isn't their fault. Amy nodded, wiping away the last of her tears. We'll make it as easy on them as we can, she agreed. They need to know that we still love them, that we'll always be there for them, even if we're not together. It was a small comfort, but it was something. We had made a decision, a painful, heartbreaking decision, but it was one that felt right, even as it tore us apart. We spent the rest of the night talking, not about our failed marriage, but about how we would navigate the next steps. We discussed custody arrangements, how we would handle holidays, and how we would ensure that the kids felt as little disruption as possible. It was practical, it was necessary, and it was excruciating. The next day, we sat down with the kids and explained the situation as gently as we could. They were confused, upset, and scared, and it broke my heart to see the tears in their eyes. But we reassured them that we both loved them, that none of this was their fault, and that we would always be a family, even if things were changing. It was the hardest conversation I had ever had, but it was also the first step toward healing. In the weeks that followed, we began the process of separating our lives. Amy found a place nearby, and we worked out a custody schedule that would allow the kids to spend time with both of us. We divided our assets, untangled our finances, and slowly, painfully, began to disentangle ourselves from the life we had built together. There were moments of doubt, moments when the enormity of what we were doing threatened to overwhelm me. But in those moments, I reminded myself that this was the right choice, that staying together out of fear or guilt would only prolong the pain. We were letting go, not because we didn't care, but because we cared too much to keep hurting each other. The day Amy moved out was surreal. We had packed up her things together, trying to keep the mood as light as possible for the sake of the kids, but there was no avoiding the sadness that hung over us. When the moving truck pulled away, taking with it the last of her belongings, I stood in the driveway, watching it disappear down the street, feeling a strange mix of relief and sorrow. We hugged one last time before she left, a long, lingering embrace that said everything we couldn't put into words. "Take care of yourself," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "You too," she replied, her voice trembling. "I'll always be here if you need anything." I nodded, unable to speak, and watched as she got into her car and drove away. It was the end of an era, the closing of a chapter that had defined my life for so many years. But as painful as it was, there was also a sense of peace in knowing that we had done the right thing, that we had made the choice to move forward, even if it meant leaving each other behind. In the months that followed, life slowly began to take on a new rhythm. I threw myself into work, into spending time with the kids, into finding new ways to fill the void that Amy's absence had left. It wasn't easy. There were days when the loneliness was almost unbearable, when the weight of the past threatened to drag me down. But little by little, I began to heal. Amy and I remained in contact, mostly for the sake of the kids, but there was no animosity between us. We had found a way to co-parent, to be civil, even friendly at times, but the deep bond we once shared was gone. We were no longer husband and wife, but two people who had once loved each other, now moving on in separate directions. The kids adjusted better than I expected, though there were still difficult moments, times when they missed the way things used to be. But with time, they adapted to the new normal, and I did my best to make sure they knew they were loved, that they still had a family, even if it looked different now. As for me, I began to rediscover who I was outside of my marriage. I reconnected with old friends, took up hobbies I had long since abandoned, and slowly started to rebuild my life. There were moments of sadness, moments when the memories of what could have been threatened to overwhelm me, but I learned to let them pass, to focus on the present, on the life I was creating for myself and my children. Looking back, I realized that the journey I had been on, as painful as it was, had taught me more about myself than I ever could have imagined. I had learned about resilience, about forgiveness, not just of Amy, but of myself, and about the importance of letting go. I had learned that sometimes, the hardest thing to do is also the right thing, and that moving on doesn't mean forgetting, but rather, accepting and choosing to live again. Amy and I had loved each other once, deeply, but that love had changed, had evolved into something that no longer fit the mold of a marriage. And while it was heartbreaking to let go, it was also necessary, for both of us. We had both made mistakes, we had both hurt each other, but in the end, we had chosen to find a way forward, even if it meant walking separate paths. The last time I saw Amy, it was at a school event for the kids. We exchanged polite smiles, made small talk about the children, and then went our separate ways. It was strange, seeing her as just another parent, another face in the crowd, but it was also a reminder of how far we had come. We had found peace in the aftermath of our storm, and while it wasn't the ending I had once envisioned, it was an ending nonetheless, one that allowed us both to move forward, to find our own versions of happiness. As I watched the kids play, their laughter filling the air, I felt a sense of contentment wash over me. Life was different now, yes, but it was still good. I had survived the worst of it, had come out the other side stronger, and I knew that whatever the future held, I was ready to face it. And so, I took a deep breath, let go of the past, and stepped into the future, one day at a time.